This is a production of Cornell University.
Well, I started out with a desire to be a physicist. I was interested in searching, for fundamental relationships. But that interest migrated from the natural world to the social world when I got interested in what made government policies work or fail. And that led me to the broader question of what led political systems to succeed or fail. And then I focused on the problem of revolutions, and I became a specialist in revolutions throughout history. When I studied revolutions, one of the things that struck me that hadn't been appreciated before was the degree to which the disruption of societies that preceded a revolution depended on the inability of a government to cope with long-term accumulating population changes. Often population growth, but also changes such as urbanization, growth in the youth cohort, things that nowadays people take for granted, actually. You can't read anything about the Arab Spring without hearing about youth bulge and youth surge. And I was working on that more than 20 years ago, so it's nice to see people have adopted the concepts. And then more generally, this notion that demography matters for politics is becoming widely adopted, and that's at the heart of my current research. Now that's an edited volume. It's called Political Demography, and it's all about how population changes are reshaping the world. We're really entering kind of a new, fascinating time. It's not just a question of the world population growing. People raised their eyebrows a little bit when they said, global population hit 7 billion last year. But that's not the big news. The real big news is that the majority of the world's population is now urban rather than rural. And so we've tended to think about the problems of poverty in peasant villages. And while there's still some of that in the world, for the next 20 or 30 years, I think the global economy is going to depend on the welfare of people living in cities, particularly million-plus cities in the developing world, in India, China, Indonesia, parts of Africa. That's actually going to be the fastest growing component of the world's population. The effects of population on the global economy and global politics are so wide-ranging. Myself and a couple of other authors who were working on this realized that there were about a dozen different angles and approaches being followed by promising scholars, all the way from junior scholars to very senior demographers. And we thought it would be fascinating and very useful for teaching and even for the general public to bring together some of the best people talking about how population matters for our future. And so this book project, which I did together with Monica Duffy-Toft, who's now at Oxford, and Eric Kaufman, who's at Birkbeck College in London, the three of us said, let's look at international security. Let's look at ethnic conflicts. Let's look at domestic politics, even in the United States and Britain. And let's look at the politics of immigration. All of these have become very hot topics now. Is it the case, for example, that aging in the rich countries will lead to a geriatric peace, as we don't have any need to fight each other anymore? Our main concern is supporting our own aging populations. Will it be the case that ethnic conflict will explode in Africa or the Middle East as we see different ethnic populations growing and maneuvering for power and territory? The Kurds, for example, in the Middle East, coming together as a critical group in Iraq, Turkey. We're also asking about the impact of migration. What are the new global migration streams going to be? Is it going to be mainly out of Africa? That's what it looks like, and more out of tropical Africa than out of either North Africa or Latin America. So these are big changes that are coming down the pike. They're coming at us very fast. I think most people really don't appreciate yet how rapidly countries like Germany and Japan and even China are aging. People don't appreciate how rapidly countries in Africa are still growing. So there's this really remarkable imbalance building up between aging rich countries and fast-growing, very young poor countries that I think is going to be the critical economic dynamic for the next 20 or 30 years. Some of the most important findings have to do with policy recommendations. What are we going to do given how fast the world is changing? Let me point up three. One is on global security. The United States has had a difficult time dealing with jihadism and disruption in Afghanistan and Iraq. Those were relatively small countries, 20, 25 million population. Afghanistan, in the time that the United States has been there, has grown from 25 to over 30 million people, despite the problems of the war. We're seeing rapid population growth still in the Yemen. There has been a surge of youth all across North Africa. And so if you ask, who is going to help put the broken pieces back together if these societies break down under the pressure of population growth, struggle for resources, conflict among different factions? It's going to be much harder for the United States to work with NATO, because all of our partners in NATO are facing the same problem of aging populations and shrinking military age populations as well. If we look to the Far East, our allies, Japan, South Korea, also very rapidly aging, and their economies are not supporting growth. So if we think in global terms and say, what is going to be the crucial security alliance for the global future? It's got to start including some of the larger emerging economies, countries like Brazil, India, Mexico. These are large countries in terms of population, but also in terms of their economy. But their manpower is much less expensive. And if we need to put boots on the ground, we meaning the liberal Western capitalist countries, if we need to put boots on the ground to help bring order to countries that are in turmoil, it's not going to be possible unless we restructure NATO or other security arrangements to really bring in these emerging giant nations. Now that's security. If we also talk about economic growth, it's a different story. One of the most striking findings is that 90% of the people, young people, under 15 years old in the world today are all growing up in developing nations. That is to say, less than 10% of the world's under 15s are found in Europe, the US, Japan. Now that 90% of the world's young people, that's the labor force of the global economy in the future. So 20 to 30 years from now, if that labor force is not productive, the global economy is going to be very hard-pressed to find workers. And what we've seen in North Africa is you can have people acquire an education, but if it's not an education that outfits people to be productive and competitive in the global marketplace, they are not going to get the jobs they desire, and you're going to have political conflict over unemployment, wages that are not keeping up with prices, and demands that government restructure. So my concern is that the world needs to think very seriously about working on the education and the access to capital and knowledge for young people in places like South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Now those are places that we've either neglected in terms of the global economy because they were small, or worried about because they were badly governed. And both those things are true. If you look at the population of sub-Saharan Africa, as recently as 1950, Africa was small compared to Europe. Population was only about half that of Europe. However, we're looking at a future in which not only has the population of Africa just recently surpassed that of Europe, in the future, population of Africa will double while that of Europe stands still. So if we're looking for growth in markets, growth in the labor force, it's absolutely imperative that those areas that we've neglected or written off as conflict zones, they need to be integrated into the global economy. Otherwise, we're going to lose an enormous amount of the potential growth that we could see. People who are interested in economic growth usually turn to economists. They have the reputation for being the experts on that. But what we've seen with the Great Recession that we're in now is that we didn't have all the answers we hoped for. And in fact, it turns out that the causes of economic growth are much more complicated. One can't simply add a certain amount of capital or add a certain number of years of education and expect to always get a positive outcome. We've seen that in Egypt and Libya and Tunisia, which put a lot of money into resource development and education and reaped chaos and disorder rather than orderly growth. I think economists have come to appreciate that it's the nature of institutions that govern whether resource use will be efficient and whether growth will occur. But I think economists by themselves have a fairly simplified idea of what institutions involve. Here's where sociology, I think, is essential. Sociologists really are focused on understanding the multiple structures of society, the networks that connect different groups in society, the shape of the organizations, the relations among organizations. Do they compete with each other? Are they isomorphically copying each other? What drives innovation? What drives entrepreneurship? These are social essentials. So I'm excited that in my work, when we're looking at what drives urbanization, what's the relationship between the age structure of a population and the ability of the economy to grow, we're certainly worried that if you have too many young people and not enough capital to employ them, the result is a political disaster. On the other hand, one has to be very careful in making sure that education is geared to be competitive and that capital deployment works to maximize employment rather than just to maximize the wealth of the few. One of the things that we've learned in combining economics and sociology is that bottom line GDP growth doesn't tell you whether society as a whole is really benefiting. The real positive impacts of economic growth are not just more income. They lie in transforming the relationships among people, giving people greater freedom, greater autonomy, greater confidence, a greater sense that they can compete, start new enterprises, and really make their country and their region a stronger place to be. Now, that is a kind of complicated endeavor. It can't be done just by policy interventions from above. It can't be done just by relying on economic formula. It really requires an understanding of how markets, organizations, consumers, and entrepreneurs work together to create positive economic growth. And that really is at the intersection of economics and sociology, and I think that's an exciting place to be. One of the great things about sociology is that sociologists don't treat societies simply as a collection of characteristics. We look at the relationships among different peoples and different groups. And the latest strain of research deals with those relationships by examining network structures. My own work, I worry a great deal about whether the network structures in a society are primarily hierarchical, vertical structures, which work through coercion and patronage. Those are fairly good for keeping a society stable, and that's why we have a lot of stable dictatorships. But they don't allow a lot of freedom. They don't allow the free movement of information or ideas or capital. They tend, unfortunately, to bottle people up inside those vertical structures that keep people separate. On the other hand, societies that tend to be more innovative, more productive, are ones in which the social networks have a lot of horizontal ties, or ties that bridge gaps between people in different areas or different specialties. So we find that economic growth depends on having clusters of firms that work in a given area where they can pool interest and pool research. But for those firms and those clusters to thrive, they have to be networked across regions to suppliers, consumers, and to sources of new ideas. If they're vertically controlled by relationships from the center, what we get is kind of old-fashioned corruption, patronage politics, and those are an obstacle to growth. Now, it's what we're seeing in an exciting way in China, for example, where a kind of bottom-up economic growth that you'll hear more about in some of the other talks in this series, but it's that bottom-up building of networks, building of horizontal ties that has contributed to growth. In contrast, in places in the Middle East and Africa, where the vertical hierarchy still dominates, we find it's a struggle to get growth started. The big driver of the global economy in the last few decades is what everyone calls globalization. That is the greater distribution of consuming, production, through global networks rather than having everything located within national boundaries. And this has been, most economists and sociologists agree, both a big change and a big plus for growth. People have global opportunities, global markets to serve. However, we've seen a backlash in recent years. We've seen opposition to immigration. We've seen concern about rising protectionism. The World Trade Agreements have started to be replaced by multilateral and bilateral agreements. It's been a struggle to get people to believe that increasing their ties to other regions and other people really is both necessary and good for their economy. In fact, this big downturn that we're in has led a lot of people to say we need to protect ourselves, focus on our own needs. Now, unfortunately, if you look at global population trends, you see right away that that's exactly the wrong thing to do, because the rich countries are getting dangerously old, and the poorer countries are getting dangerously young. And if we insist on blocking the easy movement of capital and people across those boundaries, we're going to have a lot of young people who can't get work in the developing countries, and we're going to have increasingly elderly populations in countries that don't have the internal economic growth to meet their commitments for health care and pensions. The only way to make this population system work is to bring together the resources and the ambitions of young people in the developing world with the experience and capital of countries in the rich world. So I keep reminding people that we have to redouble our efforts to make globalization work. The demography demands it, and if we turn away from that, we're really storing up much bigger problems in the future than we even have now. The one trend that I think people find it hard to grasp is the power of exponential growth. A lot of scientists have said, it's easy for us to think of 2 plus 2 is 4, 2 times 5 is 10, but if you ask people, what is 2 to the 5th, it doesn't easily come to mind. 32, that's a big number, right? So when you talk about population growth in some parts of the world being very strong, in other parts it's weaker, people tend to see this as, that's going to matter in the long term. It's nothing that I have to worry about now. But in fact, it is something that we have to worry about in a 10 or 20-year period. So if you think about people who are starting families now, what kind of world are their children going to grow up in? And if we're not careful, it could be a very different world than the one we're in now. One example, even though the number of people in the world is growing more slowly, the number of people entering the middle class, that is, people who have enough money to buy a car or who want to put more meat in their diet, that is growing very, very quickly still. It's still growing exponentially, so that we expect the number of middle-class consumers in the world to grow by 100%, perhaps 200% within the next 20 to 30 years. Now, that means people will want to consume more chicken and beef, they'll want to drive cars, they'll want to take more vacations, and we're already using almost 1/3 of the world's arable surface to grow grain to feed animals to meet the global demand for meat. So we really need to think, can we afford a middle class growing globally to consume as the middle class does today? And I think the answer is clearly not. But that means we have to start thinking today about changes in diet, lifestyle, and production. How do we compose cities so that when we have 100 cities of 10 million people in the world, they represent a good place to live and not just a kind of dangerous Blade Runner world? Because that's where the majority of mankind is going to be 20 or 30 years from now. So we're looking at very dramatic changes in the number of people in the middle class, the number of people living in cities, what we can expect the world to manage in terms of climate, production, consumption, and waste. And we need to start addressing those things immediately and not say, we can worry about that 20 or 30 years in the future. We'd like to make sure that when the future 20 or 30 years from now arrives, it comes in a form that we're happy to welcome and not in a form that scares us.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.